Hello and welcome to episode 5 of The Space Between Your Ears. Still rocking the nice new banner behind me. I'm Brian Cady. This is, as always, presented by Godzilla Media. And if you need to, I forgot to do this. There we go. If at any point you have any comments, questions about the show, my Twitter right down there on the bottom, scrolling throughout the show at Brian Cady. And if you have any questions that are longer form than you can fit in a tweet, or if you want to share your own personal story, your own journey, by all means, the email right down below, brian.cady@godzillamedia.com. And this is an awesome episode for me because as well as sharing my own story and having friends of mine come on and share their stories, I also want to get a professional point of view about mental health and, what is being done, what can be done going forward. And to help me discuss that is Elizabeth Siematkowski, and she is a therapist based out of the northern portion of upstate New York and not too far from where I am. I'm in Amsterdam. I'm like Fulton, Montgomery County area. So, we're relatively close, but Liz, thank you for coming on. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited that you reached out, and I'm excited to be here, and I'm really grateful for the work you're doing, and you devoting your life energy to such an important topic, and especially as a male, to really be talking about mental health is also really encouraging to see, and really important. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. Oh, please. The honor is all mine. And we were talking a little bit before we started taping this. So let me just, before we get into your background and what led you into being a mental health counselor and professional, let me just get into that comment you made about being a male. And just in general, really, the stigma, and this is something that, again, like I mentioned before we started taping, the stigma out there of talking about mental health or talking about emotions, it being like, it's very, how should I put this? It's, it's a negative, like it has a negative light on it. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like at all that stigma is going away? Or do you feel like there still is a lot more work to be done for as far as the view from the public eye?
Mm-hmm. I'd like to think it's getting better. I'd like to think that, mental health isn't this separate thing from, being a person or from our culture and society, that it's just a part of our overall well-being. And with men specifically, there was a great article recently in The Atlantic that I read. And what struck me was that it was kind of a wide study that included some interviews with young males, primarily high school age. And I think what these young males were saying is they want to have conversations with one another, and also other people in their lives about emotions and just human stuff, mental health, being one of those, but feeling a bit unsafe to do so just based on that culture of masculinity and what that means. And so it's hopeful to me that some of these conversations are being had. And then, people like you are leading the charge with podcasts like this. So I would like to think that it's changing. And, we're talking about sports and psychology and mental health a bit today. And, Michael Phelps just put out that documentary in the last couple of years, The Weight of Gold. And there were a lot of males included in that documentary as well, who really opened up about their well-being and mental health. So I definitely feel hopeful that there's a shift happening. Mm-hmm.
Now let's go back to the beginning. Yeah. When you were growing up as a kid, what was your dream job then versus, say, when you were looking at colleges when you're like 16, 17? Like, how much of a difference was there between a young Liz and teenage Liz.
Oh man, this is so funny. So growing up, I always wanted to be like a Las Vegas showgirl, and I would tell people that and kind of pick up on something that like, okay, I'm like that doesn't seem to people aren't getting that, you know. And then as time went on, I kind of realized like what I just saw like dancing and the costumes and whatever. I didn't really know the whole culture there. And then I was like, oh, maybe I'll be a rockette. I love Radio City and my parents were like, well, Rockettes are like almost 6 feet tall. You're like 5 foot. That's not really, And so then I went into figure skating and I'm like, oh, I found my thing. So I was a competitive figure skater probably from the time I was like really seriously around 7 until probably 18. And so that was kind of my passion, my world. So I kind of thought I would be doing that forever, but then, that's a young sport. So 18 is pretty much just elderly at that point. So I was like, oh no, I've got to figure something out. And along my competitive skating days, I had met and worked with a sports psychologist that was really impactful in my competitive career. And so I thought for a while that I maybe wanted to become a sports psychologist, but then after going to college, I kind of was more interested in general well-being and mental health. So then I got a master's in mental health counseling. So now I just really work with the gamut of individuals and presenting concerns, which I love. But I definitely have a soft spot for athletes and what that is like from a mental health standpoint. So that's kind of my journey in a nutshell.
And what's interesting is that as far as the entertainment value is concerned, showgirl, rockette, figure skater, it's not terribly that far off, really.
It really isn't. It really isn't that far off. Yeah. So it's, kind of and then nowadays, I still strap on the skates occasionally, but I'm really into the outdoors and I love nature and getting in my kayak and, I'm in the Adirondacks as much as I can be, out traipsing around. So, I think that you're right. The entertainment piece was there, but over the years, I've kind of shifted to finding connection and energy and joy in other areas like the natural world. But I still like that, kind of showbiz sort of performer thing. It's yeah.
And the thing is, I'll be honest, as somebody who grew up playing baseball and basketball, I mean, training is pretty basic. There's not a whole. You do basically everything on the field, and that's pretty much it. But like figure skating, that can be rather, especially competitive figure skating. Like, I don't think people realize how intensive that training can be. Like, as far as the hours, the expectations, especially if you go to like high level competitive skating. Like, how far along are we talking about here that you got?
I mean, I graduated high school a year early. So when I was 16, I left home and moved to this training facility and I was, all in, I wanted that Olympic glory. And then, it was kind of a crossroads of, okay, wow, you're 16, 17 years old, having to have this life conversation about the reality of, that this is a sport that seeing somebody who's 20 would be a rarity. So I kind of had to make a decision about, do I keep going or do I, maybe open up to some education or to doing something else in my life? So, I was really into it, that's for sure. But you're right. I think that figure skating and individual sports carry a great weight, but so do all sports. Working with athletes, I'm going to say baseball, you bringing that up, there's a lot of individuals in sports and team sports who also carry an immense weight and pressure. And there's a lot of things that people, a lot of ways people kind of internalize that pressure. And there's a lot of ways that it shows itself. There's a lot of athletes, sport of baseball, for example, who have a lot of obsessive compulsive behaviors. And so, okay, if I wear my lucky socks and tap my arm 3 times and, rub the bat twice, then we're going to win the game, and it's like, Well, those things have nothing to do with winning the game, but it's just an example of the length that we humans go to try to feel safe and try to feel in control, especially in a place like sports where there's so many things that are just out of our hands. So I think athletes, I would be hard pressed to meet a serious athlete who doesn't experience some level of anxiety or depression. Yeah.
Oh, don't get me started on superstitions. Oh
Yeah,
man,
yeah.
I mean,
Right?
granted, my athletic career ended when I was like 15. But I remember when I played baseball, I had two very specific superstitions. Don't you dare step on that foul line going on or off the field. And I had a very specific bat that I had. And if it got misplaced at all, oh, that was Angry Brian right
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah. That was for me. It was my skating tights. It's like they could stand up on their own at some point. My parents were like, "We have got to wash these. This is like a hygienic issue at this point." I'm like, "You can't wash my lucky tights." Blah. They're like, "These tights can like walk on their own. They're just like starched with, just all that."
Oh,
Anyway, but those are the but that's just an example of the extremes of what an athlete does to try to feel a sense of control or certainty where there's so much that can happen. And so that's why I'm excited about this podcast, and also things like Michael Phelps's Weight of Gold, that documentary, and even Naomi Osaka recently coming out with her whole journey and experience, just to kind of, like you were saying earlier, not only normalize but just humanize our stuff. It's not scary or bad. It's not a problem. It's just we're human beings and we do the best we can, and sometimes that unfortunately comes out in ways that can make things even more problematic for us. So, like, not washing your tights for however long, or only being able to use one bat. Yeah.
oh, this is the space between your ears. Presented by Godzilla Median. My guest this week is Elizabeth Siematkowski. And before we get diving into this, the sports end of everything again in a second, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least bring up the topic of the COVID-19 pandemic, because that had a huge impact on all kinds of aspects in life. And I can imagine it being different in certain ways, going from speaking to people one on one, having very personal conversations, emotional conversations, one on one, face to face with somebody, and then shifting to like a telehealth kind of role where you're doing more stuff through Zoom or FaceTime or whatever that may be, or even just, God forbid, a regular phone call, which is something that's very foreign to people in 2021, but
Totally.
whatever.
Mhm.
What was dealing with the pandemic like, as far as, going through, emotional times that patients were having and being able to help them through their struggles?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing, also being a person in the pandemic, you meet with clients and you may have um, shared experiences or shared concerns or things that have happened, though every person experiences something different. Even if you seemingly went through the same thing, your interpretation of that would be different from the other person. So, but it's been interesting to be going through this with clients. I'm also someone who's experiencing this pandemic for the first time. So that's been an interesting dynamic in that way, and bond maybe. But I think I was talking with a friend about it, and I'm like, I didn't even know what Zoom was a little over a year ago, and that just has become, that's what I do now with clients. I think a lot of individuals seem to miss that in person, time and energy. But I think I think there's a great value to it. And I think it actually makes it more accessible because, like I was telling you, now I can see people all over New York State. And really, it saves time. You're not driving to an office. Clients can just, it's much easier to squeeze in a session if you don't have to then drive there and park and then drive home. And so I think it makes it a little bit more accessible. But like anything, I'm sure there's downsides. People get distracted, there's animals around, other family members, but I think for the most part, at least on my end, it's been a huge gift to still be able to see people in this time.
Now, you mentioned having a special place for athletes and dealing with them as patients. Generally speaking, though, are there certain disorders or treatments you have a preference to, or that you enjoy dealing with more than others, or is it just whatever comes across, you work with it?
Yeah. I think outside of I'm not really set up for a high level addiction, or someone who would be in a suicidal crisis. I don't have the resources to be able to manage those types of presenting concerns. Though if someone came to me and that's what they were dealing with, I'd try to help set them up with someone who could help them, or a place that could help. So outside of those, I really welcome pretty much everyone. I don't really work with kids. I think I'm more 12 and up, so that's kind of my wheelhouse. I love adolescents, I love college age, and then I even have some elderly clients. I love that age group. It's people are so people are incredible. I feel so privileged every day to sit down with people and be like, wow, you've shared this stuff with me. And I'd be hard pressed to know if some of the closest people in their lives know these things about them, and so I feel really privileged to be able to get to that depth with another person. And so I really like meeting with all. I don't really have a favorite presenting concern, I guess. But I guess you asked about treatment. I'm really into mindfulness. That's something that that's probably my number one mode of working with clients is how do we get into the present? That's where things can happen, is right here, right now. That's what we can work with. So that's kind of my thing, I guess, that I tend to lean towards with clients.
Oh, mindfulness. I haven't heard that word in about 18 months. I could go pull out a whole folder right now about mindfulness.
I love it.
Oh, man. Yeah. Because the therapy I went through at Four Winds that I was mentioning before we started taping, it was very DBT. So mindfulness was definitely something that was hammered home as one of those skills. And it's the thing where, and not any one skill is necessarily, it takes a toolbox, I guess would be the best way to put it. But if there's like a small handful of ones that definitely are top of mind, mindfulness is a pretty darn good one, to say the least.
Yeah, and I love that. And DBT, dialectic behavior therapy, is an extraordinary. Actually, I was just listening to the most recent audiobook by the individual who started DBT, and she has an amazing story. She actually was hospitalized for the majority of her youth, and out on the back end of that, against all odds, not only put herself through graduate school in the 70s, but then became the person who created DBT. So, that it came from a really inspired and a place and a person who really had some adversity that she overcame. And so, but mindfulness, I don't know if you felt this way, but sometimes people are like, well, I can't just sit back and not do anything. And I'm like, well, mindfulness isn't not doing anything. It's actually the opposite. It's being so tuned in fully, mind and body, that we are so cued in that we can really pay attention to what's happening, to make decisions that really resonate with ourselves, so we can move towards where we most want and need to be. Because when we're up here, we miss stuff. But when we're here, we see, so it's not just hanging back, it's actually being really in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very much an in the moment. Best way I could put it, when somebody asks me, because I've had a couple people ask me about my stuff at Four Winds, and when I mention the kind of therapy, I'm like, there's times where you just gotta be more guttural than mental. Like you have to think more with your gut and your basic instincts, and because once it gets up here, that's when you get self-doubt and you get just a lot of questioning. And even if it's not questioning yourself, it's questioning the decision-making process you're having, even if it's involving somebody that's not you. And it's that, then that's when you go into that deep dark hole and you have to dig yourself all the way out again. It's just, some people just have that circle of life where it's just in and out, in and out. And if you go more guttural than logical, that can help.
I could not agree with you more. I love that. I'm really, that's so cool you brought that up, because there's a book that came out, I think maybe in the last decade. It's called the Mind Gut Connection, and 95% of the serotonin in our bodies is actually in our gut, not our brain. And so what you were saying is so true. They call it the gut feeling, and that's because the body knows. When it hits the body, that's the truest. That's our inherent, knowing. And then, like you said, once it hits the brain, then it's like, well, what about this? And what about this? And then this happened last time, and what's going to happen here? So really, 9 times out of 10, when whatever we shake through ends up being what that gut feeling was. And typically, at least most people I speak with, their gut feeling is usually on the money, right? So trusting that is a really safe bet. And that's because that in that microbiome, that's where the goods are, so we can really listen and know that my body's telling me something. I can listen. And that's another thing with athletes. They have that inherent body wisdom, more so just because they're using their body. That's their instrument. That's their whole thing. And so leaning into that body wisdom can be immensely helpful for athletes, and for all of us people, all of us human beings. Yeah.
To borrow a phrase that some people use in sports when coaches make certain bad decisions, we call that outthinking the room. It sounds cliche in a way, but it's so true. Like you have to. There's just times where, and even if you're not trying to make a decision, you're just trying to relax. Or in my case, like I know sometimes there's certain nights where I can't go to sleep for like an hour or two because I can't get my brain to shut up. So it's just like you gotta detach yourself and just shut it off. Like just don't even acknowledge it. Just if you're trying to go to sleep, like throw on music, download the Calm app and listen to a meditating story. I don't know. Throw on the TV if you don't mind falling asleep with something flashing in the background. Turn on the TV, mute, and just try to fall asleep like that. Like something just to, again, just shut everything off, go with your instincts, and that's that.
Yeah. And it's kind of in that way, to what you're saying, it's kind of freeing to be like, my body knows. I like to say that antidote to anxiety is trust, right? Because anxiety is uncertainty. What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to me? And trust is that and the body wisdom and that intuition and that gut feeling, as you're describing, is like, whatever happens, I'm here. We forget we're going to be there for whatever that thing is going to be. And well, we've made it through this far. We made it this far, so like, wow, yeah, something might happen, but I'm going to be there. And I trust me. I got me. It's like, I think it was Mark Twain said that my life was filled of immense extreme ups and downs, most of which never happened. And it's true. It's like most of our days are pretty baseline, but we can like bring ourselves on a ride that's just like, whoa, and that kind of goes back to that presence thing.
Like, I swear, I'll stop with the analogies, but
I
I,
love analogies.
I've got the role in my head, but it goes back to connect back to what you did competitively growing up. It's like, let's say a 10-year-old figure skater is learning, like, trying to learn new stuff for a new program. It's like the coach says, go do a triple axel. And then like you may know in your gut skill wise you can do it. But if you have any ounce of second guessing or fear, or like, well, what if I don't land the right way? What if I twist my ankle? What if I don't get enough lift? What if I don't get enough spin? Like, once you start doing that, you're not going to hit it, and you're just back to step one with your program, essentially.
Totally. And that's that's the game with sports, right? It's the body knows. Many athletes, they've been doing this since they could basically walk. Baseball players have been playing. You've been playing in the womb. When your parents were watching baseball. It's part of your program, in that way. And so completely, it's that muscle memory. And kind of at that point, when you get down to the moment, it's really 80% mental at that point, because the body knows what it's doing. It's done it thousands of times. It's just the mindset, that really can move us away from trusting the body. And that goes for daily life as well, and interactions, and workplace and relationships. Sometimes we don't listen because we're in a story around it versus actually engaged with what's happening.
I'm Brian Cady. That's Elizabeth Siematkowski here on The Space Between Your Ears, and presented by Godzilla Media. And now let's dig a little deeper into the sports side of it. To you personally, and with the way you deal with patients, what's the difference in your approach with normal therapy and just regular everyday patients, and those specifically coming in for sports psychology purposes?
Yeah. So in the summer prior to the pandemic, I was doing some work in Lake Placid with the figure skaters in the summer, and that sports psychology work was very specific, where we would talk about actually coming up with a pre-practice and pre-competition routine, and really teaching hard and fast skills like progressive muscle relaxation, mantra work, visualization, breath work. So I would say, depending on the setting and where the individual is at and what they're wanting and needing, with clients who are athletes, and maybe a bit more specific in growing that toolbox like you were referring to. But outside of that, there really isn't much of a difference in the work that I would do with someone who's coming in for general anxiety, or some grief or loss, and then an athlete. We're all people, but it might just be some different tools that I would incorporate based on what they're wanting and where they're at and what they need.
Now, I have to do a quick sidebar here, because you mentioned you're in Lake Placid for skaters. I gotta put this out there. I finally went to Lake Placid for the first time 2 years ago. Yeah, 2 years ago. Because I was helping with a friend coaching a basketball team for an AAU tournament, and I, I was personally, I got goosebumps because I'm a sports nut, I'm a geek, so I'm like, oh my god, this was 1980 Olympics, this was Miracle on Ice, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god,
Oh,
like, and the hotel I stayed at was across the street from Herb Brooks Arena. I'm like, oh, I'm like, oh, this is amazing. So I was a little kid when I was at Lake Placid. I couldn't help myself, but
oh, such a magical place.
so beautiful too.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like I'll say this for anyone who is either A, within a 3 hour drive of well, first 4 hour drive of Lake Placid, or B, is just a general sports geek like me.
Go.
Yeah, you gotta visit. Even if you're not a sports geek, just go there for the visuals and the
Totally.
downtown area. It's the Q's Village. Just go. Like if you like Lake George, you're gonna love Lake Placid. That's how I
Totally.
put it.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And with the sports piece, it is magical. It is, that there is something, as far as society loves sports, we love athletes themselves love sports. People love watching sports. But I think something that's really essential in the work that I do with athletes, and again, to bring up Naomi Osaka of, the tennis athlete, I think we know these people. They're our favorites. Oh, I love this player. They're my favorite. Or, oh, I've watched him. I love him on this team. Or he's my favorite. Well, have you ever had a meal with the person? Have you ever been to their house? No, we don't know these people, but we feel like we do. We feel some ownership to these athletes, and that takes a huge toll on the athlete themselves, because there's an expectation about who they're supposed to be. And so a lot of the work I do is separating the person from the athlete, or the person from the performance, because in this culture we can really attach our worth to externals. And man, do athletes, that is so intertwined. Like, oh, I won, I'm a good person. Oh, I missed the goal, I'm a bad person. Oh, I won, I scored this touchdown, I'm a good person. Versus those are things that have happened, but they're separate from your personhood or your worth as a person. And so that's a lot of the work I do too. And especially life after sports, if your worth is your sport, then it's like, who am I outside of here?
Mm-hmm.
Versus, this is a hugely important part of your life, but this is separate from your divine human worth, And so when the sport ends, you're still a worthwhile human who deserves a full life.
Oh my god, like you hit the nail on the head for something that I have had in my head for the longest time, because people don't really think about the fact that these athletes that go on and play professionally, especially those that have long careers, they've essentially been, and this might be the wrong word for it, but obsessed with what they do to get to that level for 25, 30, 35 years. And by the time they're 35, 30, 35, 40 and getting out of the sport, it's kind of like okay, now what? There's not a whole lot of them that either A, they left school early to go pro and don't have a degree to fall back on, or B, they got a degree in something they probably don't have a whole lot of interest in. They just did it just to get the degree, and now they don't know what to do, if anything, with it. It's very rare to find athletes. This is not me to put down athletes. It's just a fact of life, because of how obsessive the sports culture is in this country specifically. It's very hard to find athletes who are forward thinking enough within the process to get a degree in something they have a passion for, so that when that ultimate ending comes for their athletic career, there is something to fall back on. Or even if they don't have the degree, just some kind of hobby or interest that they know, because in the end, and this is particularly a problem in the NFL, and you'll probably agree with me here, people also don't notice how a lot of these players, like, yeah, you learn about their money figures up front. That doesn't necessarily mean they're holding on to it. Like, a lot of them are spending it, this and that and the other thing, the house, the car, whatever, giving out family loans, whatever. But a lot of pro athletes are broke by the time they get out, and that's why they do signings and all that stuff. So it's like, you know, it's just and it's not necessarily their fault. It's just like they're so wrapped up in what they're doing as an athlete. So I just think that it's refreshing to hear people like Naomi Osaka, like a Kevin Love in the NBA, or a Dak Prescott from the NFL, who are just like, look, we're humans, we have issues, and I just want to be treated like one.
Right.
And I feel for them, because the media can be a lot of sharks in those waters.
Mm-hmm.
Having been part of that before, there could be a lot of sharks in those waters, and you gotta be sometimes a little careful about what you say or how you say it.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't imagine having to live like that. Like, as a pro athlete, the camera's on you essentially 24/7. It's insane.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, that to your point, it's like, okay, this isn't the end. This may be the end of my athletic career, but this isn't the end of me. You
Right.
know, and let's say, you know, a best case scenario, baseball, I mean, you've got some guys in their late 40s, you know, that's still really young, relatively speaking, you know, and then you have a sport like figure skating or gymnastics, you have Olympic glory, or, you know, you spend your
You're
whole
done by
life.
25 or 30, basically.
Well, even
Even younger sometimes.
yeah, you're like, you know, 18, 19 years old, and then you're feeling like, oh my gosh, how can anything compare to this? So that's something that I really like to work on with individuals, is developing the person outside of the sport. So there's kind of, once that does come to a close, that they still feel full in their being and are excited about life, and certainly a natural grief and loss, as with anything, but building in, like you said, not necessarily a degree, but something, some sort of education, some sort of passion. And that's difficult in defense of an athlete. I mean, full-time athletes, you're never at rest. You know, you're at the movies, you're thinking about, you're here, you're eating this way, you're sleeping. I mean, everything you do is for that sport, essentially. And so the whole lifestyle, but taking some time to add in some things along the way that are going to help you when you're on the other side of that sport, but also within the sport too, because then the stakes don't feel so high, like, oh, I failed. It's like, I may have, you know, our team maybe lost, or maybe I missed this goal, or didn't really, you know, nail it over here, but I'm still me. You know, I'm not a failure. You know, this was the sport, was the day. And so just creating that space is something I'm really passionate about.
So you mentioned age in the beginning of discussing that your last response. I'm gonna put this in a little perspective, not just for you or anyone listening, but for myself here. Let me begin with Michael Phelps, because people are like, oh, you know, he did so much. His first Olympics, and I'm gonna look at this. Let's see. Try to do the age difference. He was 20. No, not even. He was 19 in his first Olympics in Athens. So by the time he stopped, it was 2016. So he spent like 12 years. Yeah, like, and then on top of that, you think of qualifiers. So really, he spent 15 years. He spent basically his whole formative period of life, from late teens through 20s into his early 30s, where he's thinking nothing but swimming, advertisements, money. Like, that's it. Like, that's the three things he's focusing on, basically. Now, on top of that, because I thought of these ladies specifically when you were talking, and I had to look this up. arguably the most popular uh, group of young women in the Olympics in recent years were the final five from the gymnastics team in 2016. Okay.
Mhm, mhm,
There's three big names that came out of that. Lori Hernandez, who was trying to make a comeback for this year's Olympics. She's
mhm,
20. She'll be
mhm,
21 soon.
mhm, mhm,
Uh, Michaela Maroney.
mhm.
She's 25. She'll be 26 later this year. And Simone Biles is obviously the most popular, most successful out of them. She's 24.
Yeah.
Like, like it's insane. Like
Mhm,
people will think about how young these ladies are, or
mhm,
men that are involved too. It's like, man, like they, in a way, like these athletes who devote themselves to being professional athletes, and it's another thing I don't think a whole lot of people think about. They basically give up any idea of normal childhood once they commit. Like they're not going out and partying all the time. They're not, they're not hanging out in college dorms all the time. They're not you know you know they could have a prom coming up, but the most important thing they're thinking about is their next swim meet or whatever. It's like some people don't understand how mentally invasive and controlling it can be for athletes of that level to push themselves to being better and better and better.
Yes, yes. And one thing that I really liked about the Weight of Gold documentary is one of the figure skaters that was on there, Sasha Cohen. She kind of talked about historically. You think about athletics going back to like the original Olympics. The Greek. All of it. It's all about intimidation. I'm strong. I'm puffed up. Like you can't cut me down. And so it's just you want to be physically fit but mentally fit. So any sort of quote unquote weakness, like you were saying earlier, that's a possible in for that opponent historically. So just the whole athletic space really hasn't made room for some mental health. And anyone who has been interested in sports psychology or mental health at large in the sports community is to enhance their performance. So that's something that I'm really interested in too, is how can you enhance your personhood and then also feel like your worth is greater than your performance,
Mm-hmm.
and in feeling so, that will then in effect help the performance because you won't be placing so much of yourself into this one thing. But you're right, it's hard not to when every move you make 15, 20 years is for that one thing. Yeah.
For lack of a better phrase, what do you believe are some warning signs, I guess be the best way to put it, or um, just actions or words that should stick out for a parent, a friend, a colleague, for somebody that should look into speaking with a sports psychologist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So do you mean just in someone who's involved in athletics?
Yeah, like like
Mhm.
like is there are there like certain characteristics that you see in the
Yeah.
athletes you speak to that are provide a common theme as to their symptoms and what's going on with them? There's like a common theme or common traits you think that stick out that people could, you know, their friends or family could, notice and maybe sit down and talk with them about getting it addressed?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, if you notice, someone just, they seem disconnected or they're not themselves or habits have changed or some of those obsessive patterns, sometimes athletes, even, on teams, some of those obsessive compulsive behaviors or anxieties will become so pervasive, it prevents the person from getting onto the field or getting, so if some of these things if you start to notice someone's disconnected or not feeling the joy that they once felt in the sport, or they just seem really distant, or some of these behaviors are kind of acting up. Those are all things, and who knows what it could be. It could be something going on, in their lives, grief and loss, relationship stuff, or it could just be, some isolation of carrying the weight of that sport. And so a great chance to speak with a therapist or a friend or a counselor or a sports psychologist about, okay, how do we manage some of these pressures? Sometimes the higher an athlete gets, it's like the farther they feel that they have to fall. And it's almost like, oh, I wish I could go back to the days I was just kind of, because that pressure. So noting, okay, the more the pressure increases, that doesn't mean that you have to, you're still a worthwhile human. That doesn't mean that you have to be a certain type of way now just because the stakes are higher. And that kind of goes back to Naomi, just the higher the stakes, the more this expectation. And so I would just say, those might be some warning signs. But I think any high level athlete, and I think any human, could benefit from therapy. I believe in the work. That's why I'm in it. I love the therapeutic field. I think we could all, when our mental health feels good. I mean, I personally don't see much of a difference between the mind and body. I really look at the being. But if we've got something going on up here, it's going to come out in our lives, in our bodies, in our lives, in our actions. So I think anybody could benefit, but those are some just warning signs offhand.
Yeah. Last thing I want to ask, before we wrap things up. If someone out there is watching or listening, whether it be on YouTube or Apple or Google Play or Spotify, plug there. If somebody younger is watching or listening, what advice would you provide if they had an interest in potentially getting into a career in mental health counseling? Is like it can be personal advice, academic advice, wherever direction you want to go with this. What would you say?
Okay. Well, I just had a thought, back to really quick before, before I answer that. If someone, also just a reminder that with the age and with athletes, our lives have chapters, and even in my own life, my skating days were some of the best times in my life, but my life has just continued to get better and better. The love I have for the outdoors, the love I have for my dog, the love I have for the people in my life, that there is so much to life. And being an athlete, you forget, because your life has largely just been this one thing. And so somebody who wants to get involved in the helping field, there's a lot of areas to go into. And I would just say, you can always reach out to someone who's in the field. People could reach out to me and see what that involves, because there's a lot of different areas. And the reason that I went into general mental health counseling is so I can work with all kinds of people, all kinds of age groups, and athletes. So I liked the wide variety. But somebody who's interested in getting into sports psychology, there's a lot of different ways to do that. If education isn't for you and you're an athlete and you have a world of experience, you could always offer, just support and workshops. And so there's a lot you can do without going the education route. And if you do choose to go the education route, there's a lot of different areas within the mental health field, and just kind of seeing what you're interested in. Do I want to work with individuals? Do I want to work with groups? Do I want to work at a non-for-profit? That could inform what path you specifically take, what degree you specifically take.
Well, I have to say that this has been a real joy for me to have you on. As the show progresses, like I mentioned, I've been trying to, kind of branch out the different aspects and viewpoints about mental health, and having you on was definitely a plus. A former competitive figure skater, Lake Placid lover, mental health counselor, dog lover, from what I guess we just learned.
Hold on.
Uh, yeah, Elizabeth Siematkowski. Thank you for being a part of the show, and I definitely hope we'll stay in touch and catch up soon. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, and I'll be tuning in. And thank you for the gorgeous and important work you're doing. And I feel so honored to have been asked to be here and to share this time with you. So thank you.
Oh, trust me, the honor is all mine. Once again, if you want to follow me on Twitter, Twitter at Brian Katie, scrolling bottom of the screen, or if you have any questions, comments, stories you want to share, so on and so forth, the email is also scrolling at the bottom, brian.katie at gozillamedia.com. With that, that wraps up this show. Thank you for tuning in the space between your ears, and we'll catch you next week.